All right. So, look, thank you for attending my talk and everyone else's talk. Been some fantastic conservation and community-based conservation talks so far, which is what I want to talk about in Australia. We're at the infancy of implementing what we're calling the 1 Million Turtles Community Conservation Program, which has a real framework around science and you'll see what I'm talking about there and involving communities, which is something Australia's been really reluctant to do. It's been really conservation's been a government thing to do, more so, but I think really being scared about, involving people and aspects that are uncontrollable. But we need to embrace it because that's where things can get done and can get done over a broad scale. So we're calling this the 1 Million Turtles Project. And the idea is really to get millions of turtles back into Australian populations which have been starved of baby turtles for 100 odd years. There's been quite a few papers recently, really important papers about the global declines of freshwater turtles, and Australia's not immune. And I've kind of framed it about this talk about where have all the Australian turtles gone and why does it matter. So I'm going to sort of talk about that because we've heard a lot of talks over the last couple of weeks about the wildlife trade, the spectacular, which is quite spectacular and in your face, but we don't really have those issues in Australia. It's not so much turtles being ripped out by people, but what we're actually seeing is, significant harvesting and significant mortality, which is largely not seen. And so what we're seeing is declining populations occurring as rapidly as anywhere else in Australia, in the world, out of sight, out of mind. So we've got significant road mortality, which I'll talk about. The big issue is certainly invasive species, foxes particularly, which are the major nest predators and significant destroyer of adult females as well. And over the last couple of years, we've seen some spectacular, issues around disease with the Bellinger River snapping turtle, but a whole range of other issues related to water quality and agriculture. You can see this turtle in the right-hand corner. It's been affected by the last drought down in the Murray River system, our major river system, where salinity, fresh water, has essentially turned saline, and it's been affected by marine tube worms, and tens of thousands of these turtles died essentially under our noses. And the other big issue that we'll see, that common species essentially almost being entombed alive by urbanisation. So you can have wetlands, you see the bottom left-hand corner there, that were there, a year or so ago, but essentially filled in by housing, and this is a significant issue. So the first issue I want to sort of highlight is the road mortality, which we just saw in the last talk about citizen science. We use citizen science, used an app called TurtleSat, which we created. And in the first year, the first nesting season, there was a spectacular, I keep using spectacular because we just don't know, we didn't know anything really about mortality. Yes, we see turtles hit on roads, but the scale of it, this is just essentially the first nesting season of people reporting it on the roads throughout southeastern Australia. And this is our most common turtle, and I inverted commas common, called the eastern long-necked turtle, which is throughout southeastern Australia. But it's declining, and we're seeing declines of up to 91% throughout, over the last 40 years. Also, I talked about urbanisation, and it's significant. And we've actually now, I guess one of the things we don't really see it being quantified, but we did. So we went and created a wetland inventory for around Sydney, Greater Western Sydney. You can see the middle sort of hotspot area. These are areas that have lost about, you can see in red, and about 20 or 25% of wetlands have essentially been filled in. They're not just removed, they're essentially filled in. And if they're not endangered species, really very little is actually done about them. They're just totally clean fill and put houses over the top. And so the same species, the eastern longneck turtle, we've done some landscape modelling. Now you can see on over here on the right-hand side, sort of a hotspot map, where you can see that the distribution has really become quite fragmented from 2000 to 2007. And then in the last decade, you can see that the hotspots essentially have now become fragmented. And we estimate that there was about 40,000 to 100,000 turtles, eastern longneck turtles, that were either probably killed or displaced over this time. So this is the cost of urbanisation. And so especially if species, we're seeing declining common species that don't rate on environmental impact statements and that kind of thing. And essentially they're being entombed alive. But the big ubiquitous threat for Australian freshwater turtles are foxes. So foxes are invasive. They were introduced in the late 1800s. And we've shown for the last 40 years that pretty much throughout southeastern Australia, nest predation rates are around 95 to 100%. So there essentially is no recruitment going on in Australian freshwater turtle populations, at least in, particularly the southern half of Australia. The difficulty with foxes, and you'll see why we're sort of dealing them with particularly with management, is that they are so hard to impact, or at least manage them so that we can actually reduce nest predation rates. So if you actually look at the figure above, which is nest predation rate, and on the y-axis, on the x-axis, you'll see an index of fox numbers. What you actually can see here is that it isn't until you get to almost 0 foxes in a population where you actually see declines of nest predation rates. You can see it's largely across, around 90 to 100%, and this is throughout southeastern Australia here. This is data collated throughout, and it's not just one population. So the difficulty is you'd think, and in most management of foxes actually rely on the fact that you actually take one fox out, you'll have an impact on your population by reducing nest predation rates. But you have to essentially eliminate foxes, which is impossible on a landscape level to actually have an impact. So what we're seeing are significant declines. So if we look over here, this is the Murray River system, which is our major freshwater river. It's our food bowl, it's agriculture, but essentially we've done surveys in particular focus areas for the last 40 years, this team. But this here is actually, on the y-axis, is essentially catch per unit effort of the 3 major species in there. If you go from left to right on the x-axis, you're basically going from the River Murray mouth all the way up to the headwaters. And in this area down here, particularly, where it's, downstream, where you've got the significant impacts of a whole range, including water quality and that sort of thing, we are now seeing declines and almost extinction these are common species. They're not even rated as endangered or threatened. So we're actually now seeing localized extinctions at a regional scale. And this isn't just, as I said, some of our colleagues that are part of this study have been trapping here since the 80s and actually trapping huge biomasses of turtles. So this is a real event that's occurring and is essentially a combination of all of these threats. And I'll quickly show you some of the modelling that we've done and why the combination is really important of threats. So this is again just a model extended out 200 years of a turtle population. The top line up here essentially represents a turtle population with high but variable nest predation rates, and they can handle it. 75% plus or minus 25% nest predation rates, they don't actually decline. They're actually doing pretty well. They're used to high nest predation rates. So, but you then apply the high levels, the extremely high levels since foxes were actually introduced. So 90 plus or minus 10%, they're declining. That's the second line here. So they are being restricted. but you throw that extra threat where we talk about mortality on adult females, or disease, those kind of things, those small level of adult predation plus the restriction of recruitment sends the populations in a deep dive towards extinction. And we are now seeing that with some of our most common species. So why does it actually matter? Well, this is what we've been looking at for the last couple of years to actually, as I said, this is hidden. Everyone loves turtles, but they actually fulfill a significant role in the ecosystem. You may have heard, but we've actually had over the last summer in this Murray River system, the Murray-Darling system, we've had a significant fish kill events. Millions, absolutely millions of fish have actually died in these systems. But essentially, as you've seen, we've actually lost the turtles out of that system. The other thing is that the Australian government actually want to introduce a biocontrol for a virus to control European carp in these systems. So again, costing how much it would take to actually remove dead carp, significant numbers of dead carp. The turtles actually provide that role. If they're actually in there, they're really, really important for that. And we've been doing these mesocosm experiments and now scaling it up. And Claudia Santori, my PhD student, will be talking in a couple of weeks about these experiments. But you can see in the figure here, just to, looking at water quality, and we've been measuring it, with and without turtles with a fish gill, you can see on the left-hand side, huge amounts of bacteria, cyanobacteria and algae, but on the right-hand side here of their pretty clear water, and you can see the skeletons actually in there of turtles. That's what they do, they're scavengers, and we can actually quantify those ecosystem services. Okay, so obviously really important for the ecosystem, and we are losing them. Essentially, this is where the Million Turtles program comes into it. And how do we actually strategically manage freshwater turtles throughout these ecosystems? And I quickly will just show you what we're trying to do on a landscape level. And essentially, the red area here, this is to scale, represents a harvest population. And so essentially what we're utilising the longevity of turtles, and we're utilising their fecundity to actually manage turtles throughout a population by using harvest populations and translocations. So essentially this red area here, the number of turtles that are produced can actually service and restore turtle populations to scale across these regions. And you can imagine now, using metapopulation dynamics and setting up networks of harvest populations, we can actually have a significant impact and start restoring populations by this method. And I know I'm going on for too long, but I quickly want to show you some of the issues, because we can't actually, obviously deal with foxes across the large scale. So we focus all our efforts onto these harvest populations for translocation. We can start dealing with, these threats that are actually occurring by focusing on these areas. Now, just quickly, some of the techniques we're actually looking to harvest turtle eggs and restore them. As you can imagine, we're doing some work in situ with an integrated approach. So we've got communities doing nest protection, going out just simple wire mesh and that sort of thing. We're actually created islands. So this here you can see in the middle is a mare of a local urban area here in Sydney, where the community created an island, essentially an island that is full of cat litter trays, and the turtles actually came up and nested. You can see the eggs here in these areas too. So we're now deploying these. We're actually creating designer nesting areas, you can see further down. So these are what we're trying to do, obviously, to beat foxes, is to essentially create areas where turtles can nest, communities can actually protect, and we can harvest hatchlings. Other areas we're working with, like I think, urban areas like golf courses, areas like parks and water treatment plants in urban areas, huge densities of turtles, a great resource, and often have fencing and a whole range of things that we can actually start using, creating these harvest populations, and the community can start doing it. We are looking at ex situ and implementing ex situ, particularly for working with this Australian Reptile Park for the endangered species, where we can't do a lot of this stuff, but also we heard about turtles in a classroom. We're doing the same thing. We're actually created these things called turtle pods. You can see down in the right-hand corner where you can do 1,000 shipping containers where we can do 1,000 eggs at a time. But lastly, what I'm going to leave you at is the framework. And this is just quickly, what we need to do is essentially create a framework where people, individuals, schools, private owners, community groups, wetland managers can actually implement. You can see in the middle here, the range of things like nest protection to islands, to nest relocation and head starting. That's appropriate for their area, and that's where the science comes in. But also the greater framework of how to get people to do it and how we set up this network really requires buy-in from conservation agencies, particularly, like I said, the Australian Reptile Park, but Foundation for National Parks and Wildlife, that do this. This is their bread and butter. What they need is us as scientists to actually provide that information and do the research so that then they can educate and help communities to do it in the right way. So I'm going to leave it there. I'll leave the video going here that we've sort of created, but I'm happy to take any questions. And don't forget 1millionturtles.com so you can read more about it.
All right, Ricky, we have a couple of questions, and one was from earlier in your talk, and they were asking if the issue was due to just a rise in the salinity in the rivers near the mouths to the ocean, near the mouth of the river.
So it's, yeah, the groundwater. So obviously with agriculture, it certainly is. When you have droughts, you certainly will get those issues actually occurring throughout the Murray. It's certainly not just down near the mouth. It extends many hundred kilometres from the mouth further up. So yes, absolutely. So it extended. The turtles are actually, the community groups there were actually really good. They took them in and tried to scrub them and do them, but we did lose tens of thousands in that event.
3 more questions. The second one is, how quickly do the tube worms grow on the turtle shell to the extent that it affects the turtle's health?
It's a hard one to know exactly, because largely when they were being seen, that was extensive. They're actually hauling themselves out really sick and injured. Like I said, I think a lot of stuff that happens with freshwater turtles is out of sight, out of mind. We have people who've lived in the area for 70 years when we're trapping, actually asking us, like, didn't even know freshwater turtles occurred in there. So we don't know exactly how long it takes from the start. Largely what we're seeing is the sick turtles hauling themselves out of the water.
Another viewer would like to know more about the floating island design and maybe get it, but also asks if there have been any issues with the surrounding water cooling down the temperature of that substrate, cooling down those eggs.
Okay, so we have several designs. We're working with floating island companies that, extensive for, really islands that you could actually drive cars onto. And so we're looking to implement that. It was supposed to be this season, but COVID sort of, it's likely to be next nesting season, which is November, essentially, for most freshwater turtles in Australia. No, we didn't have any issues with that floating island. That was one built by the community. So essentially, we worked with them. They essentially, we just went to the local large hardware chain, and bought a huge amount of stuff to float. To a large extent, the nesting boxes are sitting out of the water, sitting quite high, so the turtles have to climb up. And we didn't have any issues of hatchability. We do have to we're trialing some different substrates, obviously with rain and that sort of thing, that some of can get really quite boggy. So this season we're actually trialing a whole range of different substrates and drainages but to a large extent, we launched that right at the end of nesting season. It was more of a proof of concept that we can get a community to build an island and actually have it float through, storm seasons and that sort of thing. But so it was an added bonus to have a whole bunch of turtles actually nesting in there.
That's great. Another question How can we convince different stakeholders to agree to support the program?
That's where communities and engaging the communities to actually do it. And we've had a lot of, what would I say, initial reluctance. I guess, you know, I guess conservatism from governments. You know, that we heard about, you know, sort of regulatory and that sort of thing, but you know, essentially creating, and that's where the research and actually, you know, getting research permits and actually trialing things. They're happy to, you know, a lot of governments government agencies are really happy to have demos and trial things, and you have success, then you essentially get buy-in from them. We don't we we generally don't have much trouble getting people to be enthused by turtles. I think they are a taxa from around the world that people will buy into. And I think the other thing too is that, you know, that there hasn't been a real opportunity in Australia for conservation groups to actually really do hands-on conservation. It's largely been the domain of planting trees or those kind of things that is what we call, you know, active conservation. But now they actually want it, they've got a chance now to actually, you know, and particularly the other thing I haven't mentioned is engaging the amateur community, which have you know, turtles that have come from the wild, and certainly a base that we can involve of them, and they have the expertise for breeding as well.
That's great. We've got one more question.
Yeah.
Did the 2019 wildfires have an impact on wild turtle populations, and were nests destroyed during those events?
In general, no. I think terrestrially they were okay, but we did see some die-offs and fish kills, but also turtle die-offs post fire. So we're working in those communities, largely because of the runoff. Oxygen levels became really, really low. Essentially, all that ash and pH levels would certainly drop significantly, which affected certain species, particularly on the north coast. So one of the communities we're working with is the Hunter River, which hasn't been classified as a subspecies yet, but one of the short necks that you can see on the right-hand side here is in the Hunter River. They were greatly affected. And I have to say, probably we saw a lot of die-offs before the fires because of the drought. So we've had years of drought. We had years of drought leading up to that, and obviously a huge amount of wetlands and rivers drying up. That's when the turtles were affected across southeastern Australia.